Today's number 8 most urgent vulnerability is CVE 2026-59310, a critical VMware vCenter server flaw with a 9.8 CVSS score and confirmed placement on CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. That combination is why it earns time on the Daily Ranked CVE Brief, What to Patch First, ranked by Real Exploitation Signal, CISA Kev, First EPSS, and CVSS, every day. The short version, VMware vCenter contains a directory traversal vulnerability in its Syslog server, and the official NVD description says a malicious actor with network access to vCenter may exploit it to execute arbitrary code. For defenders, the phrase to focus on is not just critical, it is network access to vCenter. vCenter is management plane infrastructure. If it is compromised, the blast radius can be much larger than a single application server. So this is a patch and verify now item, especially anywhere vCenter is reachable beyond tightly controlled admin networks. Let's decode the bug in plain English. The affected product is VMware vCenter server, and the vulnerable area identified in the NVD description is the Syslog server. The weakness category is CVE-2026, directory traversal. In human terms, directory traversal happens when software accepts or processes a file path, but does not properly keep that path inside the directory or location it was supposed to use. Instead of treating input as safely constrained, the application can be tricked into reaching outside its intended file boundary. In many products, that can mean reading, writing, or influencing files in places the application should never touch. Here, the stated consequence is severe, arbitrary code execution. We are not going into exploit mechanics or payloads, but the defensive takeaway is simple. A component that handles log-related network input must be extremely strict about path normalization and validation. If that boundary fails inside a management product like vCenter, the issue moves from bad file handling to possible control of a critical management system. Verdict: this is an emergency remediation item because it is unauthenticated, network-reachable code execution against management infrastructure. The CVSS vector is 9.8, critical, AVN, ACL, PRN, UIN, with high impact to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. We do not need to recite every metric to understand why it is dangerous. The two that matter most are reachability and friction. AVN means the attack path is over the network. PRN and UIN mean the attacker does not need a valid account and does not need to trick a user into clicking anything. Low attack complexity means the scoring system does not see unusual conditions as required. Then, the impact side is maximum across the board. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability are all rated high. In practical terms, if an attacker can reach the vulnerable vCenter service path, the scoring model treats compromise as both likely enough and damaging enough to justify immediate action. The real-world risk is elevated because this CVE is on CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. KEV status means defenders should treat the vulnerability as actively relevant, not as a theoretical lab finding. The EPSS percentile provided is 0.82785, placing it above a large share of vulnerabilities by exploit likelihood signal. EPSS percentile is not a guarantee that your environment will be targeted, and it is not a replacement for asset context. But combined with KEV and a 9.8 critical score, it changes prioritization. This should not sit behind medium severity cleanup or routine quarterly maintenance. vCenter commonly sits close to virtualization control, identity boundaries, backup workflows, monitoring, and administrative access paths. A code execution issue there can become an operational incident quickly. Loss of trust in management systems, service disruption, unauthorized changes, or the need to review downstream systems that depend on vCenter. The safest planning assumption is that exposed or unpatched instances are high-value targets. Conceptually, the attack path begins with network access to vCenter and reaches the vulnerable Syslog server component. We are staying defensive here, so no exploit steps, no payloads, and no proof of concept detail. What matters for blue teams is the reachability model. If only a small, authenticated, monitored administrative network can talk to vCenter, the number of possible sources is constrained. If vCenter is reachable from broad internal user networks, shared server segments, contractor VPN ranges, or any untrusted path, the exposure is much larger. Directory traversal bugs often become dangerous when input that should be treated as data is allowed to influence file system paths. In this case, the stated result can be arbitrary code execution, so defenders should think beyond simple log noise. Ask, which systems can initiate connections to vCenter's relevant services? Which network paths are allowed by firewalls? Are management interfaces separated from general workloads? Even before patching is complete, reducing who can reach vCenter is a meaningful defensive control. To check exposure, start with inventory, not guesswork. Identify every VMware vCenter server instance, including production, disaster recovery, lab, staging, and isolated management environments that may be forgotten. Then compare the exact version and build information against the official vendor advisory. Do not rely on assumptions or broad product names. The advisory is the source for affected and fixed versions. Next, map network exposure. Determine which subnets, VPN pools, administrative jump hosts, monitoring systems, and infrastructure services can reach vCenter. Because the vulnerable component is identified as the Syslog server, verify how Syslog-related functionality is configured and what sources are expected to communicate with it. If you cannot immediately confirm that a vCenter instance is not affected and that it is not reachable from risky networks, treat it as needing urgent review. Also check whether internet-facing exposure exists through misconfiguration, remote access paths, or overly permissive firewall rules. For a management plane system, internal only is not enough if the internal network is flat. The primary remediation is to follow the official VMware or Broadcom vendor advisory and apply the recommended fixes for your affected vCenter server deployments. Because exact affected versions and fixed versions are advisory specific, use the vendor source as the authority. In parallel, harden access. Restrict vCenter management plane reachability to dedicated administrative networks and approved jump hosts. Remove broad internal access where it is not required. Review firewall rules, VPN access, and any monitoring or logging integrations that can communicate with vCenter. Before making changes, ensure you have current backups and a rollback plan appropriate for your environment, because vCenter is operationally sensitive. After patching, verify the reported version or build, confirm that services are healthy, and retest network access from both approved and unapproved segments. If patching cannot happen immediately, compensating controls should focus on reachability reduction, close monitoring, and strict administrative access control. But treat those as temporary risk reduction, not a substitute for remediation. For detection, start by defining normal. Which systems are expected to send log-related traffic to vCenter? Which administrators and jump hosts are expected to connect? What does normal volume look like by hour? Once you know that baseline, look for deviations, new source IPs contacting vCenter, unusual bursts of syslog-related traffic, malformed or path-like strings in logs, and activity from network ranges that should never talk to management services. Because the described consequence is arbitrary code execution, also monitor the host and platform for suspicious process behavior, unexpected file creation or modification, service changes, and outbound connections that do not match normal vCenter behavior. Review administrative events for changes outside maintenance windows, new accounts, permission changes, or configuration updates that lack a valid ticket. None of these signals is a guaranteed indicator by itself, and we are not naming exploit-specific indicators because they are not provided here. But together, network telemetry, vCenter logs, system monitoring, and change management records can help identify whether exposure has turned into suspicious activity. To recap, CVE 2026-59310 is today's number 8 ranked vulnerability because it combines a 9.8 critical CVSS score, CISA known exploited status, a strong EPSS percentile signal, and a high-value target, VMware vCenter server. The flaw is CVE-22 directory traversal in the Syslog server, and the official description says network access to vCenter may allow arbitrary code execution. Your action list is straightforward. Identify every vCenter instance, confirm affected versions against the vendor advisory, patch according to that guidance, restrict network access to trusted management paths, and monitor for unusual syslog, process, file, network, and administrative activity. This is exactly why the Daily Ranked CVE Brief exists, not to cover every vulnerability equally, but to help you decide what to patch first, ranked by real exploitation signal. Subscribe for the next ranked breakdown, and check the full ranked report linked in the description.